know, if you've been around here for a while, that I quite love the television show The Good Place that was on, a couple of years ago. Now, yes, thank you, Jill. I appreciate it. So it should come as no surprise that I rushed to acquire Michael Schur's book, How to Be Perfect. So Michael Schur was the showrunner and creator of The Good Place, who has now written a book based on sort of the philosophical study of ethics that he undertook in writing this show that is about exploring, in many ways, how to be good, what it means to be good. And I love the perspective. Part of why I love the show so much is that he is honest about presenting this question of goodness, what it means to be good, what it means, I dare say, to be perfect, as a pretty complicated undertaking. And he has a great line, a great passage in the introduction of his book that I wanted to share. Most people think of themselves as good and would like to be thought of as good. Consequently, many, given the choice, would prefer to do a good thing instead of a bad thing. But it's not always easy to determine what is good or bad in this confusing, pretzel-twisty world, full of complicated choices and pitfalls and booby traps and bad advice and seemingly trustworthy friends like stupid Wendy, who said the fedora was ugly cute and convinced you to buy it. And even if you do somehow navigate the minefield of modern life and succeed at being good, you're just one person. This planet contains 8 billion people, and a lot of them don't seem to care at all about being good. There are corrupt politicians, conniving CEOs, people who don't pick up the dog poop when their dog poops on the sidewalk, and evil dictators. And stupid Wendy, what is her deal? Does she enjoy making other people miserable? So it's hard to wonder if one person being good even matters. Or to phrase it the way I did when I started reading moral philosophy and thinking about this enormous, knotted, tangled mess. What the hell am I supposed to do? I feel like it's the vibes you brought to the Deuteronomy reading this morning, Carol. Just, good luck with that. And I think it is the take that Jesus offers us on this question of perfection, righteousness that is presented to us in the Sermon on the Mount, that we have been reading and reflecting on for the last couple of weeks, and we hear certainly this morning. How on earth are any of us meant to be good or righteous? What does that even mean? Is it all just a hopeless endeavor? And I think if we spend some time unpacking our gospel this morning, maybe we find that perfection, righteousness, understood as an individual pursuit, is not what we're actually meant to be about. And what Jesus is presenting is perhaps a much more complicated, pretzel-y reality, but a much more fulfilling one in what it actually means to live into the call of love, what we might say as the beloved community with one another. So let's start off by just acknowledging that this text we read this morning is probably one of the most challenging in the Gospels, right? There's sort of a problematic framing that one often hears, especially in what we might call more progressive, liberal Christian spaces of, oh, you know, that mean Old Testament God and that nice New Testament God. And we can talk about the fact that that is actually a very anti-Semitic framework for reading the Bible. It is also a very inaccurate one. And I think reading a text like the Sermon on the Mount really challenges us from that idea that the New Testament God is just, cuddly bunnies and puppies. Because Jesus presents us with some very stark teachings about how we are called to live, and indeed the consequences of failing to live into this high example of moral, spiritual perfection of righteousness. There is a evangelical writer from the 90s-ish, Philip Yancey, some of you may know of him, and he wrote in a book, The Jesus I Never Knew, which was a very helpful book to me when I was first sort of unpacking my own very conservative, very legalistic upbringing, where he talks about the Sermon on the Mount and argues that Jesus is really laying out here an unattainable standard for perfection. And what it really shows us is none of us are going to make it. None of us can possibly achieve this, and so we must rely on God's grace. And there is certainly truth to that. But I also think there is something in that framing, as helpful as it was to me at one point in my life, that's still unsatisfactory, that still seems to let us off a little bit too easily of the reality that there is, in fact, a standard of righteousness that we are called into. There is, in fact, very real, tangible ways that we are called to live and be, particularly in relationship to one another, at the heart of our Christian calling and our Christian faith. And I think much more interestingly, what Jesus is doing here in the Sermon on the Mount, which is the foundation, the starting point, the introduction for his entire ministry in the Gospel of Matthew, is flipping the script on what righteousness actually is, what we are called to be and pursue. Specifically, a shifting of righteousness away from trying to make sure we avoid the bad things to considering what the good end, what the purpose is that we are called to at the heart of our faith. Because I do think it is very human for us to think about this question of righteousness, goodness, perfection, however we want to frame it, as making sure that we are just avoiding bad stuff, right? And on some level, as Jesus sort of lays out, that's kind of easy enough to do. Do not literally kill someone. We can all probably manage that. But I think what Jesus is laying out is that there is actually a higher goodness, a higher end that we are called to pursue. Yes, okay, you should literally avoid killing someone. And yet, living defined by anger, bitterness that divides us from one another is a kind of death. Yes, you can perhaps avoid literally cheating on your spouse or significant other. And yet we live in a world where we are conditioned in so many ways on a daily basis to treat other people as objectified ends to our gratification. I find most interesting, perhaps, Jesus' call that, or warning, perhaps, that yes, you can come to worship, you can bring your offering to the altar, and yet if you are living in bitterness and conflict with a member of the community, it is far better to pursue the end of rectifying that harm, healing that relationship, before coming to perform what we might call the external acts of righteousness and worship. Perhaps most complicated and challenging in our world today are Jesus' teachings on divorce, which is one that no doubt strikes many of us reading it today. Some here have experienced divorce, and no doubt many of us in our network of friends, families, and communities have walked that journey with one another. And I think Jesus is getting at something much more complicated than just laying out an objective truth that must never be altered. I think it's very important that Jesus puts this in a patriarchal framework. Men given permission to write a certificate of divorce for their wives. In a historical moment when a woman being essentially disposed of in such a way would put her in a place of incredible vulnerability. And I think on a deeper level, Jesus is saying something about the way that we live in relationship with one another, and a warning against treating our relationships and one another as in any way disposable. I have walked with many people through journeys of divorce. And there are times when divorce is an unqualified good, where it brings about a healing and a liberation and a capacity to live into grace and love in a way that could not happen in the confines of an unhealthy marriage. Yet even in such circumstances, there is a loss. And you can't easily just cut out and erase a person with whom you share much of your life. And I have not experienced that in the loss of a marriage, but I have certainly experienced loss of friendships. Or even when friendships end for a good reason, you can't deny there was a person who had been an integral part of your life for a season who is no longer there. And I think what Jesus is getting at is the complexity of relationship that we live into with one another, and comes at the very heart of this sermon and the heart of Jesus's calling to us, which is the framework of perfection and righteousness, honestly has very little to do with any one of us individually. But what it means to live fully and radically in those intertwined relationships with one another. The perfection and righteousness to which we are called is not one living in our hyper-individualistic bubbles where we are concerned with our own perfection, but the perfection of a community defined by radical, grace-filled love. Michael Schur has another wonderful line towards the end of his book where he points out that, particularly in an American context, we are taught to think about ourselves quite often, our own ends, our own happiness, our own satisfaction, and indeed our own goodness. And maybe we would get a lot farther by thinking more about one another and how we are called to live into relationship with one another. I love that our lectionary compilers paired our very, very hard reading from the Sermon on the Mount with the text from Deuteronomy, where the people of Israel stand poised and ready finally to enter into the promised land and are given a call and a choice. Where the call is not just better avoid doing wrong stuff or it's going to be bad for you, but framed in a positive way to choose life. That living into the law, the commandment, the framework of goodness that we are offered in the gospel is indeed not some restrictive reality that we are called to live into with a neurotic fixation on perfection, but a way of radical life and love realized in our commitment and care and love of those around us. Amen. Thanks be to God.